the known world. Behind the Allied soldiers lay defeat, In May of 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk became the edge of the known world. Behind the Allied soldiers lay defeat, with France collapsing and entire armies cut off. Ahead of them lay only the sea. More than 300,000 men crowded the shoreline, waiting under open skies filled with smoke and fire. German artillery thundered from inland, and dive bombers screamed overhead, their sirens designed to terrify as much as to kill. The water itself burned with oil from sinking ships, and every small boat that appeared on the horizon felt like a fragile promise of survival. Dunkirk was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. There were no clear front lines or heroic charges, only endless sand scattered with abandoned rifles, helmets, and vehicles. Men stood in long, silent lines that stretched into the sea, sometimes waiting for days, ankle-deep in freezing water. Some were wounded, some were lost, and many were simply exhausted beyond words. In that chaos, survival often depended on whether someone nearby chose to act. Among them was a private soldier from Lancashire, a man whose name rarely appears in history books. He was not an officer and carried no authority beyond his own conscience. He had marched into France like thousands of others, young and convinced the war would be short. By the time he reached Dunkirk, he was filthy, worn down, and carrying everything he owned: a rifle, a tin mug, and a quiet determination not to abandon others. When he looked around at the wounded and stranded men on the beach, he made a simple choice. He stayed. Just offshore, a sandbank had trapped dozens of soldiers. The tide had pulled back, leaving them isolated and exposed, too far out to wade safely and too vulnerable to wait. Enemy fire was closing in, and panic began to spread as men realized the larger ships could not reach them. The smaller boats hesitated, uncertain whether they could make the crossing. Without being asked or ordered, the private stepped forward. Using a battered dinghy, lengths of rope scavenged from abandoned equipment, and help from a handful of volunteers, he organized a makeshift ferry. There was no formal plan and no command structure, only urgency and instinct. One man at a time, he guided soldiers into the boat and pulled them through the surf towards safety. Every crossing was dangerous. Bullets cracked overhead, shells exploded close enough to send walls of water crashing down, and the tide shifted without warning. Still, he kept going, back and forth, again and again. Over the next 2 hours, he made 10 crossings. Some of the men he carried were wounded, others were barely conscious, their strength long gone. Then on one return trip, a shell landed nearby. The blast flipped the dinghy instantly, throwing the men into the water. Without hesitation, the private dived in. The channel in May was bitterly cold, cold enough to steal breath and strength in moments. He pulled one man up, then another, then a third, refusing to let go even as his own body weakened. By the time help arrived, his hands were bleeding and his uniform soaked, but all 3 men lived. As night fell, the evacuation entered its final, desperate hours. A last boat approached, and someone shouted for the private to get aboard. He had more than earned his place. No one would have questioned him if he had gone. Instead, he turned back. A wounded corporal was struggling near the water's edge, unable to walk on his own. The private supported him step by step through the surf, steadying him until the boat was ready to depart. Only when the corporal was safely handed into a volunteer's arms did he step back. The boat pulled away without him. Eventually, the private was evacuated later. He returned home quietly, without ceremony or recognition. There were no newspaper headlines and no medal presentations. Like so many who survived Dunkirk, he carried the memory in silence and continued with his life. For decades, his actions lived only in letters, fragments of testimony, and in the memories of the men who never forgot the stranger who had refused to leave them behind. Only recently have historians pieced together those eyewitness accounts and begun to restore his place in the story. Dunkirk is remembered for its ships and speeches, but its true miracle was built from moments like this, from ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Courage is not always loud, and it does not always wear medals. Sometimes, it is simply a single person standing in the surf, refusing to walk away. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from history. And tell us in the comments if you know a forgotten hero whose story deserves to be told.